So as I've mentioned before, like a lot, I have a toddler son. In fact, he's here with me right now. He hasn't gotten to that constant question stage yet, but I know it's coming, and I've kind of tried to anticipate what sort of questions I might get. So today I'm going to run through some common questions that it may never have occurred to you to ask.
That's a stupid question.
Or, if you did ask, you never really got a straight answer.
That's a stupid question too.
I had thought about calling this video a speed round, but if you've watched my videos before, you know I'm not exactly a man of few words.
I can't believe you don't shut up!
I will do my best to keep these short and to the point, but unfortunately I either end up saying too much, or I leave myself open to the ravages of keyboard warrior armchair academics who just want to rip me to shreds over things that aren't even that important in the first place. But, oh well. Those guys anyway. Let's dive right into 10 relatively quick answers to common questions. Number 1. Why do our voices change as we get older? As I'm sure we already know, at puberty the body goes through a major growth spurt. Now one of the biggest major physiological changes in both sexes is in the larynx. The sudden release of the hormones known as androgens caused the larynx, which is a muscular organ also known as the voice box, to increase in size rapidly, more so in boys than in girls. As the larynx grows, so do the vocal cords, which not only get longer, but also thicker, making the voice deeper. It's like it goes from being the B string on a guitar to being the A string, although it's not always a smooth process. As these tissues adjust to their new size, voice breaks are not uncommon. Other changes occur in the skull and the facial bones, the end result of which is that there's more hollow space in the skull to act as a resonating chamber. However, puberty is not the only time in your life that your voice will change. Your voice will actually continue to change throughout your life, it's just that the changes are minor and mostly unnoticeable. As you age, muscle tone is lost throughout the body, and that includes in the larynx. The lungs also get weaker and less efficient. Now all this results in slack vocal cords, a weakened larynx, and less breath to contribute to speech, thus making the voice quieter, shakier, or changing in pitch. Number 2. Why is English such a weird language? Mostly because it had such a weird history. Ancient peoples in the British Isles spoke Celtic languages from which Gaelic and Welsh descended, and which are still spoken today in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Roman conquerors came to England in the 1st century BC and left pockets of Latin speakers there for centuries, so already linguistic contamination was evident. Early English as we know it belonged to a group called the Anglo-Frisian languages, which originated in the Netherlands and northern Germany. Anglo-Saxons brought that language with them to England in the 5th century, and it eventually displaced all of the native Brittonic Celtic languages. Technically speaking, at that time, the people of England became a mix of native Britons and Anglo-Saxon settlers, and the dominant Anglo-Saxon language they spoke was a Germanic language, albeit one that was already evolving separately from the Germanic languages on the European continent. Then in the 11th century, England was conquered again by the Normans, a people from northern France who spoke a Latin Romance language. The Norman language didn't quite replace the Anglo-Saxon language in England. Instead, these two languages formed a weird hybrid with tons of Latin loanwords and spelling conventions grafted onto an essentially Germanic framework. This is why, if you look at it, English's sentence structure is actually similar to German. For example, in both English and German, we put the adjective before the noun that it's describing. We say the blue ball, but in French they say le ballon bleu. But we also spell a lot of words in a much more Latin way than a German way, and we use a lot of Latin phonemes. In modern Latin Romance languages, like French or Spanish, words are pronounced in such a way that each word will flow naturally into the next word, so consonant sounds are virtually always followed by vowel sounds, even if that means changing the pronunciation of one or both of the words. This flow is a lot less evident in Germanic languages, which gives them a characteristically clipped, and one might almost unfairly say guttural sound.
Avion.
Aeroplane.
Aero.
Avion.
Flugzeug!
Now, you'd think that a language that has so many elements from both Germanic and Latin Romance roots would result in a language that's actually easier for everyone to learn and understand, but instead it just ended up being this mishmash that's almost unintelligible to everyone.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Don't nobody understand the words that are coming out of your mouth, man.
Number 3. Is Russia in Europe or Asia? This is a question that has caused more bloodshed at trivia nights than any other I can think of. I once lost a trivia contest because the final question was, which capital city has the tallest skyscraper in Europe? I answered London, but the answer they were looking for was Moscow. I never considered Moscow to be a European city, so I was not too happy with the way that they interpreted that. I mean, I did know that the Ural River and the Ural Mountains are considered to be the dividing line between Europe and Asia, and that Russia straddles both sides of the Urals, but geographically, most of Russia, approximately 77%, is on the Asian side. The Russian region of Siberia actually makes up about 1/3 of the entire Asian continent, which is huge.
Huge problem.
It's a huge problem.
The huge problem.
That is a huge problem.
So you think he has a bigger problem?
I think he's got a huge problem.
A huge heroin problem.
Oh, I am so funny. So even though Moscow is on the European side of the Urals, it's the capital of a predominantly Asian country, and so I always considered it to be an Asian city. However, the answer is not so simple. For a start, even though 77% of Russia's land area is in Asia, it's sparsely populated. Only 25% of Russia's population lives in the vast Asian side, while the other 75% lives in the much smaller European side. So if you looked at a political map, it's tempting to categorize Russia as an Asian country, but you also have to consider that the capital city and the majority of the population do technically live in the European continent.
Well, which is it, young feller?
Both. It's both, okay? Just for trivia purposes, try to remember that Moscow is considered to be a European country. Therefore, Russia is technically the largest country in Europe, even though most of it is not actually in Europe. Now, if they ask what the largest country that is entirely within Europe is, the answer is Ukraine. So there, that's a thing you know now. Number 4. Does pineapple belong on pizza? No, never. Absolutely not. Next question. Number 5. Why are artists always shown wearing those ridiculous smocks, bow ties, and berets? It really has become the stereotypical image of the artist. The floppy smock, the snooty attitude, and of course the ubiquitous beret. We see it all over TV and in movies, but why is this the unofficial uniform of the artist?
There. No artist is complete without a fancy beret.
Well, the smock is more or less self-explanatory. I mean, it was just a protective garment that you use to keep paint off your regular clothes. And it was probably also a way to show off how artisty you were by wearing one out in public. Now, unfortunately, there's no hard and fast answer as to how artists became associated with the beret, but there are two hypotheses that work together nicely and are generally regarded as being pretty likely. First, for centuries it was considered customary for men to always wear a hat every time they went outside. Now, hats could be expensive and elaborate, or they could be cheap and simple. And the beret was about as cheap and simple as it got, so in France in particular, it kind of became the hat of the common man. This fashion continued well into the 20th century, and the phrase starving artist didn't become a cliche for just no reason. Artists were often poor and struggling, and being poor, they would have been more likely to sport an affordable beret every time they went outside. Thus, all of those penniless artists in France's left bank would have made striking romantic figures who captured popular imagination, berets and all. Second, a flat, floppy cap similar to a beret was the preferred hat of the Dutch painter Rembrandt, and he painted a number of self-portraits where he wore his trademark hat. So, that image of the great master in his beret was already somewhat ingrained into the public consciousness. The big floofy bow is even more mysterious because there doesn't seem to be any direct historical reference to it. As far as I can tell, they just kind of started appearing in the 1950s and 60s. Like any time an illustrator or a director wanted to show how strange and eccentric an artist was, they just sort of threw this big flouncy bow onto the outfit. You know, just to really drive home the fact that they thought artists were effeminate weirdos. However, I have two hypotheses about why it ended up being a big bow and not something else, and I think that they're at least plausible. First, that bow is very similar to a cravat, which is a forerunner to the modern necktie and bow tie. So depicting artists wearing a cravat-like neck adornment in the 20th century may have been a way to harken back to the notion that serious, brooding artists belonged to a bygone and more romantic age, like, say, the 19th century when cravats were common. Second, it's also somewhat similar to the scarves and neckerchiefs that were worn by mostly working-class men in the 19th century. These are still part of the traditional chef's uniform today, as well as the stereotypical Frenchman outfit. So the big bow tie may have helped reinforce that image of artists being French.